forward.
So Dr. Fesko, of course, claiming that Van Til rejects common notions, he writes, and quote on page 24 of his book. In the middle of the 17th century, philosophers such as John Locke rejected the idea of common notions. In the 20th century, this rejection made its way to liberal and conservative Reformed theologians alike, including Karl Barth and Cornelius Van Til. So, number one, he says Van Til rejects common notions, but he also links Van Til with Barth under the heading of Reformed, which is a constant refrain throughout the book. I think it happens 3 or 4 times. Van Til is always frequently linked with Barth, and we can talk about why, because ostensibly it appears that Van Til rejected natural theology. Again, he certainly does not, but that's where people make the comparison. Barth rejects natural theology, but Barth also rejects a natural revelation, and then Van Til has issues with, is very critical of an unbelieving or a neutral form of natural theology. But let me continue here. This is where rubber really meets the road. Dr. Fesko draws particular attention to Van Til's discussion of authority and reason on pages 168 and 169 of Defense of the Faith, the 3rd edition. So that's not the most recent edition. So the edition he's working with is one prior, which is fine. It's not any different from what you would have in the latest edition on this point, except the page numbers would be different. Just so you know, if you want to backtrack this, you need to find the 3rd edition. So again, he says Van Til rejects common notions, and then he says, look especially at pages 168 and 169 of Van Til on this. So on those pages, Van Til makes an important distinction. These are on the pages that Fesko cites. A word must now be said about the idea of common notions referred to in the quotation given above. This is Van Til writing. The present writer made a distinction between notions that are psychologically and metaphysically, that is revelationally common to all men, and common notions that are ethically and epistemologically common. That is Cornelius Van Til, Defense of the Faith, 168. And then Van Til goes on to say on page 168, all men have common notions about God. All men naturally have knowledge of God. Okay? So Fesko says Van Til denies common notions, and he cites page 168 of Defense of the Faith. And on page 168 of Defense of the Faith, Van Til says all men have common notions about God. All men naturally have knowledge of God. So here we need to get into the discussion of what's Dr. Fesko talking about, because Van Til says the opposite of what he claims him to say on the very page he cites. So where's the rub? What's the distinction? What is Dr. Fesko picking up on that leads him to make the opposite conclusion of what Van Til at least is saying in that sentence?
Seems to me that the common notions is a broader category for Dr. Fesko. A properly functioning common notions are a broader category for Fesko than they are for Dr. Van Til. As you noticed in what you read, Dr. Van Til says that there are metaphysical and psychological common notions that all men share, but that there are epistemological and ethical restrictions on the commonness of common, so-called common notions. So that's, I think, where the rub is.
Well, go ahead, Jim.
Oh, I was just going to say, and we've made the distinction before, right, where we would say, where Van Til says that metaphysically all men have everything in common, epistemologically or covenantally or ethically they have nothing in common, so that we understand that no believer and unbeliever approaches ethics, life, anything in the same way, because the one is by grace covenantally united to Christ and constrained towards his glory, towards the glory of Christ.
Right.
And so as such is doing things to the glory of Christ, however imperfectly in this life, with a view towards consummate fellowship and relationship with God in the new heavens and new earth, whereas the unbeliever is doing it in a way that is
Hmm.
antagonistic towards God and His glory. And so, in that sense, one is in Adam and the other is in Christ. And because of that radical covenantal antithesis, it has implications for the way in which we interpret reality or interpret the facts around us.